get started. Ms. Shockey, see that obviously Ms. Grant is here. You mind calling the roll?
Absolutely. Mrs. Williams. Dr. Baker will be tardy. He's excused. Ms. Davis. Dr. Flores.
Present.
Ms. Grant is excused. Ms. Lewis is excused. Reverend Matias is excused. Ms. Shockey, I am here. And President Ross.
Present.
Okay, we have quorum.
Thank you. May we have a motion to approve today's agenda, please?
So moved.
Support.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed, same sign? All right, thank you. We do have an agenda. It doesn't look like we have any public comment for any agenda or non-agenda items unless, no, guess not. So I'll move on to our special order of business. Ms. Cripps.
Good evening, board members. We are that time of the year. Our annual audit is finalizing, so we have our auditors here from Plant Moran. We have Mike Foster, who is a partner with Plant Moran, and Corey Van Dyke, who is a principal with Plant Moran. So I'm going to turn it over and let them walk through.
Thank you. Thanks, Rhonda. So, as Rhonda mentioned, we're going to walk through just at a high level the results of the audit. We're in the process of wrapping up the audit and getting our documentation finalized. So the documents you have in front of you are in draft. They're due to the state by November 1st. We won't have any problem meeting the filing due date, but we did bring the documents in draft just in case questions came up today that we needed to address or if anything needed to get changed. So there are 3 documents that are really the results of the audit, and then we've got our graphic presentation that we're going to spend a few minutes on going through the numbers. But I'm just going to hit the highlights of the other 3 documents first and then turn it over to Corey to go through the numbers. So the first document, the largest document, are the financial statements. So these are your financial statements, the financial statements for the district. You've engaged Plant Moran to issue an opinion on those financial statements as you have in the past. We are going to issue an unmodified opinion on the financial statements. That's the highest level of assurance that we as auditors can place on a set of financial statements. The next document is the federal awards document, federal awards audit. So because of the amount of funding that the district receives from the federal government, you're required to have a compliance audit on those federal dollars. If I could have everybody turn to page 13, which is the last page of the federal awards document. This does a pretty good job of summarizing both the financial statement audit as well as the federal awards audit. So if we start at the top, as I mentioned, does everyone have it? It's the
Nearly. Great.
federal awards supplemental information, and then all the way to the back.
Oh, the smallest one.
Yes.
Okay.
Last page.
So again, if we start at the top, as it relates to the financial statements, as I mentioned, we're issuing an unmodified opinion on the financial statements. As it relates to internal control issues, we have no material weaknesses, no significant deficiencies, and no non-compliance that would be material to the financial statements. All good things. And then in the middle of the page, we start talking about the federal awards compliance audit. Again, no material weaknesses or significant deficiencies or non-compliance. And then towards 2/3 of the way down, it lists the programs that we tested as part of the federal awards audit. So we tested the Education Stabilization Fund dollars, Title I, and the Emergency Connectivity Fund. And again, on the right-hand side, we're issuing an unmodified opinion as it relates to compliance. So based on the testing that we did of those federal dollars and the compliance requirements, we're issuing an unmodified opinion on those. Grand Rapids Public Schools qualified as a low-risk auditee. That means you've had at least 2 years in a row of financial statement and federal awards audits without any findings. You will continue to be a low-risk auditee based on the results of this year's audits. Any questions on that? The third document is the staple document, is the report to the Board of Education. In here, we're required to communicate to the board any difficulties that were encountered during the audit. Happy to report that this is a boilerplate letter, no issues as it relates to the conduct of this year's audit. In this document, we also include some informational items that talk about things that are going on at both the state and federal level that we thought might be appropriate for the board to consider as you manage the district on a going forward basis. Any questions?
Don't think so.
Okay, so next I'm gonna turn it over to Corey, and he's gonna walk us through the graphs and talk about some of the numbers at a high level. Again, as we're going through those, if you do have questions, certainly speak up and we'll try and get those answered.
Before I get into the statements, there was one accounting standard that was new this year. We've talked about it in the past, kind of as upcoming accounting pronouncement, then it was deferred and deferred and deferred. But it's GASB 87, it's around leases. So in the past, you wouldn't have seen operating leases on your balance sheet or your financial statements, but the district did evaluate the leases that are on hand. And some of those did have to get capitalized, so they don't affect your fund level financial statements, only your district-wide statements. The two primary leases that ultimately became capitalized that wouldn't have been there in the past were some copiers and some security equipment that the district has. In the past too, the museum school, that was also a lease on there as a capital lease under the old terminology. There's no longer capital leases under the new terminology, it's just leases. But at the end of the day, there was no change in accounting for that museum school. It's still on the balance sheet as an asset and a liability. Now it's just broken out on its own line versus being buried within fixed assets and buried within long-term debt. So just wanted to really kind of bring out the one change in accounting standards. All right, so the graphs. These should be in pretty similar format to what you've seen in the past. We did break out a little bit more detail in some of the classifications, but we'll go over it. So this first slide looks at total assets, and there's the district-wide assets, which is also your full accrual financial statements, and then there's your general funds. Obviously, on a monthly basis, you're more in tune to the fund level details, but the district-wide includes things such as fixed assets, debt, the district's portion of MIPSers, both the pension and the OPEB liability. All of that is in here as well. So looking at the asset side, the largest asset would be your capital leases and your your right to use assets as well, which would be the lease liability or the leased assets. Your next largest asset would be your MIPSers deferred outflows. And so those, based on the timing of the MIPSers calculations, which are based on the state's year, so that's based on the 9/30 year, you have to use the 9/30/2021 results to get to your June 30, 2022 financial statements. So it's a 9-month difference. So you have to take into account contributions that the district has made subsequent to the 9/30/21. That's what really builds up that deferred outflows number. Looking at on the general fund side, so your largest asset on the general fund would be that $26 million number, which is your receivables. The bulk of that is your state aid receivables. So that's what you receive in July and August that ultimately relate to the prior year. The next largest asset on there would be your cash and investments held within the general fund. Any questions on the assets? Okay.
Yeah.
So the next slide is your liabilities and net positions. This is the second half of the balance sheet when you're thinking of the presentation on the balance sheet. Same format as the last slide, district-wide on the left-hand side and general fund on the right-hand side. The thing I'll point out on the left-hand side, the district-wide, so that turquoise color, the bottom one there, the $458 million number, that is your portion of the MIPSers liability, the pension and the post-employment benefits. It's obviously, it's that also including the deferred inflows or with that as well. Clearly, it's the largest liability on the district's balance sheet, and it's something that you really don't have any control over. That is all at the state. GASB 68 and 75 a few years back is what requires you to record your portion of that. If you were to compare this year to last year, that number would have actually gone down. And that's because, as I mentioned, the MIPSers liabilities are based on the September 30, 2021 reports. And if you look at today compared to a year ago, the investment returns have kind of gone down. Last year at this time, the investment returns were extremely high. So because of that, the actuarial assumptions that go into the calculation of the liability decreased significantly for this year's financial statements. We would expect that to ultimately flip next year. We would expect the liability to grow again with our current state of environment with inflation and interest rates.
So just clarifying that, just broadly speaking, are you sort of indicating that when there's a downturn in the market, there is more financial liability on the district as far as MIPSers?
So what it would be is the MIPSers pool, the whole pool of assets and pool of liabilities goes up or down based on investment returns. And then that's then divvied up as a pie, almost as a pie to all the school districts.
Gotcha.
So it's not just Grand Rapids Public Schools,
Yeah,
it is
yeah.
every district, every participant within MIPSers.
Yeah, so there's two big events that impact what that liability is. One is the contributions that all the districts are making into the plan and the investment return on all the investments that are held by the MIPSers pool have a significant impact on what the net liability is at the end of the measurement period. And again, as Corey said, the measurement period for your June 30, 22 statements goes back to September 30 of 21 because that's the last year that the financial statements of the MIPSers pool were audited.
Gotcha. So when the investment pool is lower, then districts have to sort of fill in the gaps then.
Correct.
Gotcha.
On the right-hand side there, it's your liabilities and fund balance of the general fund. The largest balance on there is the turquoise balance, which is your unassigned fund balance. But that darker blue, not the, I don't know, I guess how to describe it, not the dark blue, but the medium blue there in the bottom left is your accrued salaries. So that number is for your contracted teachers. That'd be they've worked through June 30, but they're paid through July and August. So that's basically those 2 months of salaries that get accrued for. So this next slide compares year over year the breakout in revenue within the general fund. So you'll notice 2022 ended at about $243 million in revenue, while 2021 was $224 million. It's about an 8% growth. The largest growth there is within the federal funds. It's within the federal revenues, which is really the Education Stabilization Funds, ESF or ESSER, and then also the Education Connectivity Fund were the two big ones that were new this year. The next slide here is your breakout in expenditures. So again, year over year, this year was $242 million in expenditures in the general fund, while 2021 was $217 million. It's about 11% growth. Very similar to the revenue, the growth there was from all of the additional federal funding. So you would kind of expect when the federal revenues grow, you would also expect the expenditures to grow on that as well. You'll notice the categories between instruction and support and other district expenses stayed relatively consistent, fluctuated by 1%. But a lot of that change was just within the federal expenditures that were paid for. This next slide looks at the 5-year historical fund balance of the general fund and then breaks out between unassigned, non-spendable, and assigned. So your non-spendable inventory or non-spendable fund balance would be things that have already been purchased, so prepaid assets and inventory. The district has already expended those cash resources, and they'll be able to benefit from those assets within the next year. The assigned fund balance, which you don't have any assigned fund balance this year, would be in the years that you are budgeting for a use of future fund balance. So when you adopt your budget for the upcoming year, there are certain years where you'll budget to use some of that fund balance. In the fund balance position that you're in now, along with the growth of the district, state aid, et cetera, there was no budgeted use of fund balance for next year. So that's why there's no assignment this year. You'll notice that the fund balance did grow slightly from about, I think it was about 19 million to just over 20 million this year. And then the percentage there, that little line chart there is fund balance as a percentage of expenditures. So what that tells us is stayed pretty consistent year over year, but your fund balance would cover about 8.59% of your expenditures. Now this next slide, it actually looks at 1 year prior, just because all of the other districts' financial information isn't made available yet until after that November 1 deadline. What this is doing is it's comparing Grand Rapids fund balance as a percentage of expenditures to the other local districts within the area. The one thing that we will point out, and you'll notice there's that statewide average of 19.28%. for last year. That excludes Detroit Public Schools because that does sway the results quite significantly, just given how large of a district that is. But I'd say the general thing to point from this is we're expecting most districts to probably have an increase on this slide, given the amount of federal funds that they've been able to use to supplant other expenditures. Basically be able to allocate things to federal funds versus normal general fund dollars. Oh, I guess I didn't turn to that slide, sorry. That was the last slide. Any questions on the graphs?
Guess not, no?
Okay, as long as we're on the topic of fund balance, I did pass out this sheet that you've seen for years with Larry that also takes our look at the fund balance based on the early warning system, based off from revenues. So just to show you what that looks like, again, our final, I hid down all of our budget columns from last year, so it compares audited numbers for the last several years. As you can see, we're continuing to slightly build that fund balance. The proposed budget is what we presented back in June, so it doesn't have our final closeout where we did come in better than we were projecting in our budget. One thing, as Corey and Mike have talked about, we are using our ESSER dollars to supplant operating costs as well, which is the reason our fund balance is growing. It's setting us in a better position. Part of that, when we did our original ESSER plan over a year ago, we had planned to do a lot of construction. That as we've gone through, realized that that's probably not a good use of ESSER funds for us. So we are moved more dollars over to supplant with operating costs, and we'll start to fill in some of those construction type costs. Like for those of you on the finance committee saw the purchasing agenda, and we've got the HVAC work, the roofing work, and all of that planned. So that will come down and draw off from some of this fund balance that we've built up. So it looks really good. We want to keep it there, but we've got a plan for it. And we'll continue to work that plan as we go through these next year or two while we still have the ESSER funds. So we don't want to go back down to the living rate by that 5%, but as we're building, we're just going to have to continue to monitor. The other thing, as we've moved dollars over to the ESSER grant and our supplanting, those are valid expenses that we're going to continue, and they will need to come back into general operating once our ESSER funds are gone. So it's another thing, and it's going to be an ongoing process as we continue to work through. But I just, just like, it's a good thing, but don't spend all of it yet. So we have a plan. We're going to continue to do it. That construction will be a big thing. It's been slow to get started. A lot of it with the supply chain difficulties. It's just been hard to get started on that construction. So that's why part of why we've also built up that fund balance the last 2 years is when we made that shift, we haven't been able to get those projects started and start spending that money. So.
All right. Well, Tony, do you have any questions, Dr. Baker?
Yeah, if you add.
Doesn't look like there are any questions from anyone on the board, comments?
Clarification on the difference between the fund balance as reported in the graphs versus what we see here. So those are two different percentages.
Right, the expenditure view in the graphs is a traditional look. And I know back when I was in the audit seat, you always looked at fund balance as a percentage of expenditures. When the state came out several years ago with their early warning system, they based their calculation off from revenues. So it's like, well, and we've changed our board policy now to work off from revenues. So that's where we're wanting to give you the look. The traditional look that's in the graphs based on percent of expenditures versus the early warning look that's on the spreadsheet.
Thank you.
So I do, I guess, so the, and I'm sure you've gone over this, but I was teaching. So the 2022 end of June fund balance was 14%, is that correct?
That's where we're ending up. So.
And this is the one they're talking about.
So yeah, depending on the one in the bound from Plant Moran shows you the percent of expenditures. This one is the one that calculates out based on early warning and our board policy. And just kind of backtrack for you, is a lot of what we're doing with our ESSER fund is supplanting. So we've been building up our fund balance. A large portion of that will be for our construction activities that are now just starting to take place. That when we did our original ESSER plan, we had planned to use ESSER dollars for it. Have kind of decided that's not the way we want to go for a number of reasons. And so those will be coming out of general operating. So
Okay.
as those start to take place, and a good example was our purchasing agenda, which will be coming to the full board at your November meeting. We've got, I think, between $3 and $4 million of roofing, HVAC, playgrounds that will start to bring that back down to a level. But something, you know, I'm very conservative. We'll monitor that, where we're headed, how we're using our various funds, so we don't want to go back down to living at that 5%.
Okay, so I should not view this 14% as some place that we're living at, it's just because of the system.
It's a
Okay.
snapshot, and we'll monitor it, so we don't go to 5%, but don't live at 15%.
Right, so I mean, I know, I've said this before, I mean, just want to make sure, I mean, it's like, if we're at 14% on a regular basis, and we still have other things that we need to spend money on,
Yep.
like compensation, then we shouldn't be at 14%, but I get this.
Right now, I feel it's more of a timing difference
Okay.
than.
Okay.
Anything else?
I actually have a couple questions with regards to the summary of unrecorded possible adjustments. Can you share with us a little bit of
What page
this
are you on?
information?
What page are you on?
Oh, page 6.
6?
In the report to the Board of
The,
Ed.
yes.
Yeah.
So, and I appreciate that we are, doing pretty well, but I noticed that, and so I just was wondering about these examples, and then how can we, improve even more?
Yep. So looking at this, what this unrecorded possible adjustment schedule is adjustments that we discussed with management. Management elected not to record them due to the overall immateriality of them. And we also concluded them that the statements are still stated materially accurately without recording these. Both A1 in both of them is a timing difference. So GASB 33 requires you to record revenue as long as the resources are available and readily available, which is defined as within 60 days. So if you receive the accounts receivable within 60 days, you should record the revenue, or you can record the revenue to the previous year. If it's recorded outside of the 60 days, after year end, it should be the next year's revenue. So that A1 for both the general fund and the capital projects fund is just that. It's a timing difference where the receivable is outstanding at June 30, but it wasn't collected within 60 days. So the district recorded revenue in the financial statements that you saw, but it technically should have been in the next year. At the fund level financial statements, yeah, I'll state that.
And so for our grants, we typically like our grant revenue to equal our grant expense. So we had the expense recorded last year, so since it wasn't material, the income is coming in, it was just a timing difference, that's why we elected not to record it.
Thank you.
And then the A2 within the general fund, there were the district purchased Chromebooks with some ECF or with ECF funds, and as part of that, there were, when you looked at the actual invoice, there were Chromebooks, but then there was also some warranty related to that as well, and it was a 4-year warranty. So the district had expensed all of that when it was paid for. However, that 4-year warranty at the fund level should be a prepaid, because you're gonna get the benefit of that for the next 4 years. Given the district, the district bought it correctly, accounted for it correctly, it was just how the expenditures were recorded versus a prepaid asset. So a relatively small difference. So.
Wonderful.
How did you find that? That's amazing to me.
Well, I'll just kind of end with that. So, I mean, obviously a lot of thanks to Rhonda and Dan. I mean, an audit is no
Yes,
small
always.
task. Like, we were on site for almost 2.5 weeks. We go through a lot of stuff. We ask a lot of questions. We get a lot of documentation. So, again, thanks to the whole team for
right.
all the work that was put into it. So,
It was definitely a team effort from our business office staff and others we've tapped into, so, to help get through it, so.
Okay, guess, don't think we have any more questions. I guess there's no vote or anything.
I think before we formally asked you to approve it, right, Julie? I think we have voted to.
We have? Okay,
Accept
no
the
problem.
audit, so.
Can we get a motion to approve this year's financial audit?
Motion to accept the audit?
Support.
Mrs. Williams,
Yes.
Dr. Baker,
Yes.
Ms. Davis,
Yes.
Dr. Flores,
Yes.
Ms. Grant is excused, Ms. Lewis is excused, Reverend Matthias is excused, Ms. Shockey, I am a yes, and President Ross.
Yes.
Great, motion carries. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Thank you both. Our meeting is adjourned.
Thank you.